It began like any other night on Jimmy Fallon's show. A sea of eager faces in the audience, laughing on cue, sipping on the curated charm of a well-oiled production. But the atmosphere took a sharp turn the moment Sylvester Stallone walked onto the stage. There was applause, of course. He was a legend after all. But even as he settled into the chair across from Jimmy, something in his posture suggested he wasn't there to play nice. And Jimmy, perhaps emboldened by the cameras or eager to spike ratings, decided to prod the bear. The first jab came cloaked in humor. Jimmy laughed a little too hard as he rolled a clip from one of Stallone's older films, splicing it with modern-day memes and music to make the once serious scene look like a parody of itself. The crowd laughed, but Stallone didn't. His smile was tight, his eyes flat and unreadable. Fallon mistook his silence for amusement and pressed further, asking if Stallone ever felt embarrassed looking back at how ridiculous some of his early work now seemed. The silence that followed could have split the room in two. Stallone didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tone of his reply, dry and biting, shifted the energy in the room instantly. What was supposed to be a late-night laugh had just turned into something colder, heavier. Fallon tried to pivot, to steer the conversation back into safer waters, but Stallone wasn't interested. He leaned in, challenged Jimmy on why he felt the need to mock other people's legacies just to make a name for himself. The audience, sensing the tension, quieted. Then Fallon, maybe feeling backed into a corner, let something slip. He suggested with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes that Stallone's relevance was hanging by a thread, and that being on his show was the closest thing to a career revival he was likely to get. That's when the air left the room. No laughter, no music, just a dead stillness. The look Stallone gave him wasn't just anger. It was contempt. Controlled, cold contempt. Fallon tried to keep smiling, but his face was tight now, his charm beginning to fracture. Stallone sat back, crossed his arms, and calmly dismantled the idea that Fallon had any real influence, painting him as a puppet of producers, a man who depended on viral clips and rehearsed gags to stay afloat in a world that was quickly outgrowing him. The crowd, usually conditioned to cheer and laugh, didn't know what to do. Some sat frozen, while others glanced awkwardly at the cameras. Fallon, still trying to hold on to his role as the likable host, found himself on the defensive. He began pointing out Stallone's box office failures, implying that without Rocky or Rambo, he would have faded into obscurity years ago. But it wasn't just the words. They carried an edge, a smugness. And in that moment, Fallon wasn't hosting a guest. He was throwing punches in front of an audience, hoping the crowd would side with him. What he didn't count on was how much people still respected Stallone, and how quickly that sympathy could turn when it seemed like the host was picking a fight he couldn't finish. Stallone, stone-faced, waited for Jimmy to finish his tirade. Then with measured calm he leaned forward, asking a question that cut deeper than anything so far. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. He questioned Fallon's own authenticity. Not just as a host, but as a man. Did he really believe in anything he said? Or was everything a performance, carefully choreographed to keep himself palatable to both coasts? The room was on fire now, not with sound, but with pressure. And Fallon, for the first time in a long time, looked genuinely shaken. The applause sign never lit up. The laughter was gone. And all that remained between the two men was a long, simmering pause that promised this confrontation was far from over. Fallon broke the silence first, but it was different now. Gone was the playful tone, the rehearsed smirks, the boyish charm. What replaced it was thinly veiled irritation. He tried to laugh off Stallone's jab about authenticity, but it didn't land. The attempt felt hollow, desperate even, and the audience could sense it. Fallon shifted in his seat, tugged at his sleeve, and tried to reassert control by turning to the camera crew, throwing out a pre-scripted joke. But even the crew hesitated, unsure whether to follow through with the usual canned sound effects. Stallone didn't smile. He stared, still and unblinking, and then pressed forward. He wasn't there to salvage the interview. He was there to finish what Fallon had started. He brought up stories that Fallon probably hoped the public had long forgotten. Moments when Jimmy's off-screen behavior clashed with the happy-go-lucky image he projected. Times he had talked down to crew members, dismissed writers, and avoided real accountability for on-air missteps. It was no longer a conversation. It was a public reckoning. Fallon's face dropped. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at Stallone, and began fighting back. He accused Stallone of being bitter, out of touch, and addicted to nostalgia. He said the only reason Stallone was even getting interviews anymore was because hosts like him were generous enough to keep his legacy in circulation. Then he took it further. He implied that Stallone's rise had more to do with luck and timing than any real talent, that in today's world a man like him wouldn't stand a chance. Stallone finally smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've already made up their mind. He reminded Fallon bluntly that the difference between them wasn't talent or timing, it was backbone. That Stallone had built something real, with scars to prove it, while Fallon had floated to the top on a wave of scripted applause and viral games involving celebrity charades. Fallon's voice cracked slightly as he demanded the segment be cut, but it was too late. The cameras were still rolling, the audience was glued to every word, and the control room, sensing the rawness of the moment, let it play out. There was something about the collapse of the usual late-night polish that captivated everyone watching. Then Fallon made it personal. He mentioned Stallone's family, not directly, not with any specific insult, but the tone, the implication, hit like a slap. He suggested that Stallone had been so obsessed with protecting his legacy that he had become distant, even irrelevant, to those closest to him. The words didn't have to be shouted. They just had to be said. And when they were, something in Stallone shifted. The controlled calm was gone. His hands gripped the edge of the desk. His voice was lower now, more dangerous. He told Fallon to watch what, he said. The warning was clear. Fallon tried to retreat, but the damage had been done. He had poked at something sacred, and the room felt it. There was no audience laughter anymore. There were no jokes to save him. What he had unleashed wasn't the fading echo of a former action star. It was the storm of a man who had fought to survive every stage of a ruthless industry, and who had no interest in being disrespected by a man whose fame rested on bits and cue cards. What followed next was a brutal unraveling. Stallone began to pick apart Fallon's show piece by piece, exposing how most interviews were pre-approved, how questions were filtered, and how Fallon often avoided difficult guests altogether, surrounding himself with actors and musicians who would never challenge him. He accused Fallon of operating in a carefully sanitized space, afraid to offend, afraid to speak truth, always hiding behind laughter. Fallon was no longer even pretending to smile. He was quiet now, visibly uncomfortable, his eyes darting toward producers, but none of them were stepping in. The rawness was too rare, too electric, and nobody wanted to interrupt it. The tension was unbearable. It felt like the next word spoken might shatter what little professionalism remained. Fallon looked at Stallone, then at the audience, then back again, searching for a way out. But it was too late. He had invited a lion into his den and mocked it. And now, the lion was circling. The silence hanging over the studio was thick, unrelenting. Fallon sat stiffly, hands clasped on the desk as if trying to summon the composure he had just lost. The audience, unsure whether to lean forward or look away, held their collective breath. This was no longer a show. This was something real, something raw, and Fallon was drowning in it. In one last desperate move, Fallon stood up. It wasn't dramatic, just awkward. He smoothed his blazer, cleared his throat, and addressed the audience, trying to reclaim the room with a shaky monologue. He turned the situation on its head, painting Stallone as the aggressor, the bitter guest who came to settle scores instead of share stories. His voice wavered between confidence and fragility, and the cracks were showing. But Stallone remained seated, calm. His expression didn't change, and that stillness only made Fallon seem more erratic by comparison. Then Fallon leaned into a self-deprecating joke, reaching for the same lifeline he always used, the idea that he was just the harmless, lovable host. But the audience didn't laugh. Not this time. It wasn't just that the joke fell flat. It was that the room had already chosen a side, and it wasn't his. Fallon's voice grew defensive. He accused Stallone of ambushing the show. He mocked the actor's past political statements, implying that Stallone had lost touch with reality and was trying to use Fallon's platform to stay relevant. He brought up Stallone's past financial troubles, failures that had been well documented but never weaponized so publicly. That was the final misstep. Stallone stood up now, slowly, and the energy in the room shifted again. There was no yelling, just that same low voice, colder than before, as he reminded Fallon that he had lived through battles Fallon would never understand. The business, the betrayals, the years of being told he wasn't enough. He had survived it all. Fallon, by contrast, had built his empire in comfort, surrounded by handlers and yes-men who shielded him from the real weight of criticism. Then Stallone dropped a bomb. He revealed that he had nearly walked out of the interview minutes before, going on air. That backstage, he overheard one of Fallon's producers mocking him, calling him a relic, saying they were only booking him for the novelty value. Stallone had kept it to himself, thinking maybe it was just talk. But after how Fallon treated him on stage, it all made sense. The audience murmured now. Fallon's eyes widened. He turned toward the wings of the stage, but no one was coming to his rescue. The trust had fractured, and every second he stood there only made it worse. Stallone pressed on, exposing the manufactured nature of Fallon's on-screen friendships, the way he used guests for clout, offering nothing real in return. According to Stallone, Fallon didn't care about people, just content. Fallon tried to laugh again, but it was strained, empty. He looked lost. Stallone, on the other hand, was composed, almost solemn. He wasn't there for revenge anymore. He was delivering a message. He spoke directly to the audience, telling them to stop idolizing those who wear masks, who pretend to care, but only do so when the cameras are on. He urged them to demand more, not just from television, but from the people who shaped it. There was a pause then, heavy with realization. Fallon stepped back, visibly rattled. For the first time, he seemed to understand just how far things had slipped from his control. He mumbled something about respect, but no one was listening. Stallone had taken the air, the attention, and the integrity of the moment. Fallon had tried to frame himself as the victim, but all he had done was expose his own fragility under pressure. And then Stallone walked off the stage. No big farewell, no handshake. Just a quiet exit, leaving Fallon standing under the harsh studio lights, exposed in every sense of the word. The silence that followed Stallone's exit lingered long after he disappeared behind the stage curtain. Jimmy Fallon remained standing, visibly shaken, unsure whether to address the audience or simply vanish himself. The show, despite its tightly controlled schedule and polished rhythm, had just unraveled in front of millions. Nothing about it could be cleaned up with post-production tricks or witty editing. It was raw, live, and unmistakably real. The applause sign blinked awkwardly, but no one in the audience clapped. The cameras were still rolling, but the show was over in every meaningful sense. Fallon, now red-faced and disoriented, muttered a hasty sign-off. His voice cracked. His usual exit line came out rushed, without the energy or charm that usually accompanied it. The band didn't play. The credits rolled in silence. Backstage, The tension was no better. Crew members exchanged nervous glances. Producers scrambled to figure out how to respond to what had just unfolded. There was talk of pulling the segment, editing it down, rewriting the narrative. But it was too late. The story had already started to move beyond the walls of the studio. Clips of the confrontation hit the internet within minutes. The raw footage, captured by someone in the live audience, spread faster than any pre-approved highlight the show had ever released. Viewers from every corner of the world watched Stallone calmly dismantle Fallon, and more importantly, watched Fallon fail to recover. By morning, the media had their headline. Fallon wasn't trending because of a viral skit or celebrity game. He was trending because someone had finally called him out, and he hadn't known how to handle it. Entertainment blogs, news outlets, and social media flooded with commentary. Some defended Fallon, insisting Stallone had overreacted. But the majority weren't buying it. The public had watched the footage. They had seen the smirks, the condescension, the dismissive tone. And they remembered. They remembered other guests who had sat across from Fallon and been awkwardly handled, subtly mocked, or cut short when things got uncomfortable. Past interviews resurfaced, dissected for patterns. The once-beloved host's methods were under a microscope now, and people didn't like what they saw. Meanwhile, Stallone's name was back in headlines, but not because of a film release. This time, it was because he had said what others were too afraid to. He had stepped into a space known for safety and scripted flattery and refused to play along. Other actors and filmmakers quietly reached out to his team, some even posting vague messages of support. He had struck a nerve, and it was resonating far beyond the late-night circuit. Inside the network, chaos brewed. Executives held emergency meetings. Advertisers expressed concern. Publicists for upcoming celebrity guests hesitated to confirm appearances. Fallon, who once basked in the illusion of universal likability, now found himself surrounded by doubt. His image, clean, humorous, harmless, had been cracked, and there was no easy fix. He tried to fight back, issuing a carefully worded statement, claiming the confrontation had been exaggerated, taken out of context. He described Stallone's behavior as unexpectedly hostile. But again, the internet wasn't fooled. The full footage was already out there. People had watched it, felt it. No statement could compete with the truth playing out in front of their eyes. Some guests who were scheduled to appear the following week quietly canceled. Others didn't give a reason. Fallon's team panicked, floating ideas for damage control. A sit-down apology, perhaps. Maybe a special episode dedicated to self-reflection. But the more they tried to shape the narrative, the more tone-deaf it sounded. It wasn't just about Fallon and Stallone anymore. It was about the culture of late-night TV, the fake smiles, the rehearsed kindness, the constant need to perform. And in the middle of it all, Fallon found himself alone. The people who usually surrounded him, laughed at his jokes, protected him. From criticism, they had gone quiet. He had become a liability now, a symbol of something broken. He stood on the stage days later rehearsing for a new guest who was still willing to appear, but he wasn't the same. The spark had dimmed. The audience was smaller. The laughter quieter. Every eye in the room watched him differently now. Because when Sylvester Stallone walked off that stage, he didn't just expose Fallon's ego. He exposed everything the show pretended to be. The network tried everything to recover. Behind the scenes, producers pulled strings, planned PR cleanups, even reached out to Stallone's team to suggest a private apology that could be spun into a heartfelt reunion. But Stallone refused. He didn't care for optics or salvaging reputations. What had happened on that stage wasn't a stunt. It was truth, unscripted, and delivered without apology. He had said what needed to be said, and he had no interest in revisiting the past just to comfort those uncomfortable with the consequences. As Fallon's ratings dipped and the late-night formula began to feel increasingly outdated, something surprising began to happen on the other end. Stallone's name surged, not with controversy but with a kind of admiration the media hadn't shown him in years. People weren't just rewatching his films. They were listening to him. Clips from interviews, speeches, even old behind-the-scenes footage began to resurface online. Fans commented not just on his career, but on the dignity he showed in standing his ground without theatrics. He had never been one for elegant words or soft delivery. Stallone's strength had always been in presence, in resilience. And now, that presence had shaken a system known for protecting its own. Public trust began to shift. Viewers started to realize they didn't want hosts who smiled at everyone while saying nothing. They wanted honesty, conviction, even if it was messy. While Fallon scrambled to manage his public persona, Stallone quietly took interviews with smaller platforms, independent creators, podcasts that wanted real stories, not curated nostalgia. In those interviews, he didn't dwell on the incident. He didn't insult Fallon. He talked about the industry, about what it means to endure, to evolve, to be told over and over again that your time is up and keep going anyway. People listened. His words carried weight not because they were crafted to impress, but because they were lived. Meanwhile, Fallon faced the inevitable. After weeks of backlash, hesitant sponsors, and declining viewership, the network made a decision. Fallon would take a temporary leave, framed publicly as a creative break, but everyone knew it was a retreat, a quiet admission that the empire he had built on light-hearted charm had finally buckled under the weight of his own misjudgment. There was no grand farewell episode, no standing ovation. Fallon's final show came and went with forced smiles, a few shaky jokes, and an audience that clapped out of habit, not enthusiasm. He left the stage with his head down, not in shame, but in exhaustion. He had tried to play both sides for too long, and when challenged, he had revealed how little ground he actually stood on. Stallone never gloated. He never issued a victory speech or mocked Fallon in interviews. He let the moment pass naturally, and because of that, it lasted longer. He wasn't elevated by outrage, but by the quiet power of authenticity. And when he returned to a film set later that year, directing a small drama he had written years ago but never dared to pitch, he did so without fanfare. Just focus. The film, upon release, was a modest hit. But more than box office numbers, it earned him respect. Not as a comeback icon, but as a man who had stayed true to himself long after others had rewritten their values for applause. The media, so used to framing every story in extremes, couldn't figure out how to spin it. Stallone had walked into a system designed to polish everything and refuse to be polished. And somehow, that refusal had reminded people what real dignity looked like. As the dust settled, Fallon re-emerged months later in a smaller, more controlled format. A digital series. Fewer eyes, less pressure. He looked older, less sure. There were no games, no band. Just him, alone, trying to start over. And though he never mentioned Stallone directly, there was something in his tone that hinted he finally understood. That charisma without character was just a costume. And that sometimes one moment of truth, spoken calmly without anger, can outlast 1,000 jokes.